You are here to help us through our current scandal.
Click, 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 everywhere I go.
As of Saturday morning, The Devil Wears Prada 2 is reportedly headed for a 3-day opening between $75 million and $80 million, which would easily put it at #1 domestically. That is almost triple the original film's $27.5 million debut, and even adjusted for inflation, the sequel still looks ready to nearly double the first movie's opening. So let's get that out of the way right now. Audiences wanted this movie, and they wanted it badly. That makes the contrast with Michael even more interesting. Michael opened huge and is holding well, with his second weekend drop that suggests serious staying power. But Prada 2 still surged ahead, and that says something. It says there is real commercial power in bringing back a world people remember as glamorous, sharp, and emotionally legible. Even if the cultural conditions that once made that world feel believable have changed dramatically. And that is exactly the problem the sequel has to solve. The original Devil Wears Prada already softened Miranda compared to the book, but it still understood the central tension. And he enters a seductive world of fashion, power, and status, and eventually realizes that becoming more like Miranda is not a victory, it is a loss. Miranda is brilliant, magnetic, and ruthless, but the movie only works because it never completely lets that ruthlessness off the hook. Even when the film gives her glimmers of sadness or grace, it still understands that working for her comes at a human cost. The sequel changes that balance in a major way. This time the story reportedly shifts away from whether Miranda's behavior is destructive and toward the idea that everyone needs to come together to save journalism, prestige publishing, and the version of beauty and taste that Runway represents. Andy is no longer the outsider learning a lesson. She is now an award-winning investigative journalist who suddenly needs a job after being fired by text. That is a solid setup on its own. There is something timely and painful in the image of a respected journalist being discarded by a collapsing media system. And in theory, putting Andy back in Miranda's orbit during a period of industry panic sounds like a smart sequel angle. But the movie apparently takes that setup and slides into something much stranger. Instead of positioning Miranda as the embodiment of a predatory workplace culture, the sequel starts treating her like a tragic defender of art, beauty, and real editorial value in a cheapened digital world. That is where things get slippery. On paper, I understand the appeal. Miranda sees the value of what she built being reduced, commodified, and gutted by executives. And he understands professional loss too, so suddenly the two women are operating in parallel. That creates emotional common ground. The movie clearly wants me to feel that, and to be fair, I probably would feel some of it. Meryl Streep can sell almost anything. If she plays Miranda's grief over losing status, relevance, or control as real, then of course the scene works on a human level. One of the reasons the original movie lasted is that Streep never played Miranda as a cartoon. She made her frightening because she was specific. So yes, I believe there are probably scenes in this sequel where Miranda's fear of decline feels genuine and moving. But here is where the film seems to run into a wall. Miranda is not just another victim of industry collapse. She is an obscenely powerful woman with extraordinary wealth, social capital, and insulation from the consequences that define ordinary people's relationship to job loss. She rides in private cars. She can get on helicopters when she is in a rush. If Runway disappears, she still lands on silk pillows. The movie may emotionally frame her as someone watching everything she built lose value, but materially, she is not in the same situation as the writers, editors, and staffers whose livelihoods are actually being crushed. That difference matters a lot. And it sounds like the sequel knows it just enough to brush against it, but not enough to really sit with it. That is why the whole Miranda is on your side now approach becomes such a difficult pill to swallow. It is one thing to make her more human. The first movie already did that. It is another thing to turn her into a near symbolic ally in the fight to save journalism and meaningful work, especially when she spent years building her empire by treating the people beneath her as disposable. That is where the politics of the sequel start feeling weirdly fairy tale-like. It seems to imagine that one possible solution to media collapse is not labor reform, new institutions, or any real structural shift, but the moral awakening of very rich and very powerful people with better taste than the vultures currently taking over. And that is a fantasy, not a fun fashion fantasy, a billionaire redemption fantasy. A what if the cruel ruler was actually secretly good and maybe even understood your pain all along fantasy. The movie may be shiny enough to make that go down for a while, but once you stop and think about it, it gets harder to accept. What makes it even more complicated is that this sequel also sounds genuinely entertaining in pieces. The returning cast clearly knows these characters. Meryl Streep, Anne Hathaway, Emily Blunt, and Stanley Tucci have enough chemistry and history to create pleasure almost on sight. There are montages of clothes, sharp looks, warm nostalgia, and enough iconography to make audiences feel like they are stepping back into a place they once loved. And honestly, there is value in that. Not every movie needs to be a brutal takedown of the fantasy it is selling. Sometimes the fantasy itself is the point, but if you are asking me whether this sequel fully earns its emotional pivot, I do not think it does. The original movie worked because it let the glamour and the cruelty exist at the same time. That contradiction was the engine. The sequel seems much more interested in smoothing out that contradiction and inviting me to root for the preservation of this world. By making its old tyrant feel like a misunderstood guardian of quality. And the problem is not that Miranda becomes softer. The problem is that the world around her apparently becomes softer too, at least morally. The edges blur. Accountability fades. Suddenly the person who once represented workplace trauma is close to being recast as a patron saint of endangered taste. That does not mean the movie is worthless. Far from it. There is probably a lot of fun here. There seems to be too much going on, several subplots that do not sound necessary, and some side characters who barely get room to breathe. But there is still pleasure in watching talented people work at a very high level inside a glossy, heightened world. Kenneth Branagh, Emily Blunt, Stanley Tucci, and even the weirder supporting additions sound like they keep the film lively. I can absolutely believe parts of this sequel are witty, charming, and easy to enjoy in the moment. I just also think the central reframing changes what the Devil Wears Prada means. The title used to be ironic. The devil was polished, glamorous, brilliant, and still the devil.